Welcome back. I was reviewing a particular script this week, the kind that arrives quietly, but lands with full weight. What held my attention was not the public humiliation at the altar, it was the 2 years that followed, a precise, legally engineered dismantling of every financial structure she thought she'd secured inside his life. You're watching His Eternal Diary.
The church smelled like white roses and cold stone. Ethan Calloway noticed that first. Not the guests arranged in their pews like an audience waiting for a curtain to rise. Not the organist cycling through the same 3-bar progression for the 4th time, the notes beginning to blur at the edges. Not the way his best man, Daniel, kept touching his own collar with 2 fingers. The nervous habit of a man who already knew something Ethan did not. The roses. White, overblown, past their prime by a full day. Someone had ordered them too early, or the florist had delivered them late. Either way, the petals on the outermost blooms had already begun to curl inward at their tips, browning at the edges in a way that the arrangement's size was designed to hide from a distance. Ethan noticed because he was an attorney, and he noticed details that other people trained themselves to overlook. He had built his entire professional architecture on the habit of seeing what was technically present, but socially invisible. He stood at the altar in a charcoal suit, not a tuxedo, a deliberate choice that Vivian had spent 3 weeks trying to renegotiate, and he felt the back of his neck begin to cool in the specific way it did when a courtroom situation was sliding quietly out of his control. 12 minutes. That was how long he had been standing at the altar when the number became significant. Vivian was 7 minutes late to their rehearsal dinner. She was 20 minutes late to her own graduation from the MBA program he had partially funded. And she operated on a timeline that she privately considered aspirational and publicly referred to as fashionably delayed. But not 12 minutes at the altar. Not with 240 guests sitting in hand-carved wooden pews in a church that cost $11,000 to rent for a single Saturday afternoon. He did not check his phone. He stood with his hands loosely clasped in front of him, weight distributed evenly between both feet, and he let the organist's cycling 3-bar phrase wash over him while the back of his neck continued its quiet cooling. Daniel touched his collar again. Ethan turned his head 2 degrees and looked at his best man with the kind of stillness that Daniel had always found slightly unnerving, even after 15 years of friendship. "She's coming," Daniel said. The words were technically a statement, as they landed as a question. "You spoke to her," Ethan said. Not an accusation, an observation. Daniel's jaw moved before his words did, which was all the answer Ethan actually needed. "She called me this morning." Daniel said it the way a man says something he had rehearsed to sound unrehearsed. "She needed to talk through some nerves. You know how she gets before big events." Ethan returned his eyes to the back of the church, to the tall wooden doors that remained closed. The hinges were wrought iron, heavy, the kind that made a sound you could feel in your sternum when they swung open. They did not swing open. He knew, in the clinical part of his mind that he had spent his entire adult life cultivating, that the situation had already resolved itself into its final position, and he was simply waiting for the physical reality to catch up to what the data had already told him. 15 minutes. The murmuring in the pews had reached a texture he recognized from courtrooms when a verdict was running late. A low, spreading discomfort that people tried to manage through small, lateral movements, shifting in their seats, leaning toward a neighbor, placing a hand briefly on someone else's arm. His mother was in the 3rd pew on the right. He could feel her the way you feel a particular weight in a room without looking directly at it. She had been against this wedding from the beginning. Not loudly, not in any way that could be characterized as interference, but in the quiet, specific way that women who have survived genuine hardship recognize the decorative versions of it in others. She had said once, "Man, sitting at his kitchen island with a cup of coffee she held in both hands. She talks about your future like it's a project she's managing, Ethan." He had told her that was simply ambition, that Vivian was the kind of person who executed on things, who made plans and followed through on them. He had been right about that, as it turned out, just not in the direction he had imagined. 18 minutes. The side door near the vestibule opened, not the main doors, the small one that the church staff used to move between the ceremony space and the back offices. The officiant, a man named Reverend Aldous with a white beard that he wore with a kind of self-aware gravitas, appeared in the gap and made eye contact with Ethan. Just eye contact, nothing else. And in that look, Ethan Callaway understood that the next 60 seconds were going to be the last 60 seconds of a particular version of his life. The Reverend crossed the space between them in measured steps, and the murmuring in the pews died at the precise moment that felt, to Ethan, like an inhaled breath across the entire room. He leaned in close and spoke at a volume calibrated to reach Ethan's ears and no others. "Mr. Callaway, a young woman delivered a letter to the office 10 minutes ago. She said it was from the bride. I want you to know that I am deeply sorry." Ethan took the envelope. It was cream-colored, heavy stock, the kind of stationery Vivian ordered from a boutique supplier in Florence because she believed that the quality of one's paper said something about the quality of one's character. And his name was written on the front in her handwriting, slightly forward-leaning, always too much pressure on the downstrokes. He did not open it at the altar. He stood there for another 4 seconds, holding the envelope in his right hand, and he looked out at 240 people whose faces were arranged in the specific configuration that human faces make when they have witnessed something irreversible and are not yet sure what their role in the aftermath is supposed to be. Then he put the envelope in the breast pocket of his charcoal suit and walked back down the aisle. Not quickly, not slowly. The way he walked into a courtroom, with the steady, metronomic confidence of a man who already knew how this ended. He did not look at his mother as he passed her pew. He looked straight ahead at the iron-hinged doors, and he pushed them open himself, and the October air outside hit him at approximately 52 degrees Fahrenheit, carrying the smell of exhaust and fallen leaves and the particular coldness that comes in when summer finally admits it has lost. He read the letter in the parking lot, sitting in his car with the engine off. It was 3 paragraphs. He read it twice, and then he folded it along its original crease and put it back in the envelope. He placed the envelope in the center console, not the glove compartment, because the glove compartment would have felt like hiding it, and he was not going to hide from this. Vivian had written, among other things, that she had realized she was not built for this kind of love, that she needed room to become the version of herself that she couldn't access inside their relationship, that she hoped someday he would understand that this was the kindest thing she could do. She had also written that she had already moved out of the apartment they shared, that the key was with the building's front desk, that she had spoken to her own attorney regarding the dissolution of their shared financial arrangements, and that she hoped they could handle everything with grace and professionalism. That last part was the part that Ethan read a 3rd time. She had spoken to her attorney. Not, "I'm sorry this is so sudden." Not, "I know this will take time to process." She had led the logistics of her exit with the legal architecture she'd already built around it. She had a timeline. She had counsel. She had, he would later discover, been building the exit for approximately 4 months before the wedding date. Yet Ethan sat with the engine off for 6 minutes. Then he took his phone from his jacket pocket, opened his contacts, and called his own attorney, a different one from the partner at his firm who handled his professional affairs, a specialist in asset dissolution and financial forensics named Marcus Webb, who answered on the third ring despite it being a Saturday afternoon. "Marcus," Ethan said, "I need you to begin a full audit of every financial entity that has my name adjacent to Vivian Hartwell's, every joint account, every shared investment vehicle, every business venture where her name appears within 2 degrees of mine." A pause. "Ethan, is everything—" "Today," Ethan said. "I need preliminary findings by Monday morning." He ended the call. He sat for another 30 seconds. Then he started the engine. Chalmers pulled out of the parking lot and drove back to the city. The apartment was different, not empty. She had left the furniture, or most of it, the pieces that were too large to remove, without renting a truck and drawing attention to the exit. But it had the specific quality of a space that has been selectively evacuated. There were rectangles on the wall where her paintings had hung, pale ghost shapes where the paint had been protected from the light. Her shelf of architectural design books was gone. The small Italian ceramic bowl she kept on the kitchen counter, where she placed her earrings before bed, gone. He made coffee with the machine that was still there. Cheap grounds from a bag he'd had for 2 weeks, the kind that left a slight bitterness at the back of the throat. Yet he sat at the island where his mother had once told him that Vivian talked about his future like a project she was managing, and he drank the coffee. And he let himself feel precisely one thing at a time. Humiliation arrived first, the way it always does. The specific, public variety that 240 witnesses make possible. He sat with that for approximately 4 minutes, the image of their faces cycling through his mind with the kind of detailed recall that his profession had trained into him. Then he set it aside. What replaced it was not grief. Not immediately. What replaced it was the thing that had gotten him through every case that looked, gut, in its early stages, like a loss. Or the thing that other attorneys in his firm called his problem architecture. The ability to strip a situation down to its load-bearing elements and identify precisely which structural piece, if removed, caused the entire opposing position to collapse. He began, methodically, to think about what Vivian had actually done. Not emotionally. Architecturally. She had exited a relationship 4 months after the final deposits on their wedding had been paid. Deposits that, in the aggregate, totaled a number north of $60,000. He had fronted the majority of those costs, not because there was any formal agreement about who paid for what, but because Vivian's family money was, as she described it, tied up in trust structures that don't release until she was 34. And the wedding was happening in her 32nd year. But he had also, over the course of their 3-year relationship, made 12 investments in startups and small businesses that Vivian had introduced him to, recommended with her characteristic precision, her MBA vocabulary, her ability to make speculative ventures sound like inevitabilities. 3 of those investments had performed reasonably. 2 had been structurally adjacent to entities in which Vivian, or members of her professional network, held equity positions. That was the part Marcus Webb was going to look at first. Ethan finished his coffee. He rinsed the cup. He placed it in the drying rack with a precision that was partly habit and partly the need to impose some small order on an apartment full of ghost rectangles. Then he went to his home office, opened his laptop, and began to work. The preliminary findings arrived Monday morning, as requested. Marcus Webb had the quality of a man who understood that thoroughness and speed are not opposites, that with the right resources applied correctly, you could have both. Ethan read the 41-page document at his desk before his first meeting of the day. He read it with the same attention he gave to opposing counsel's briefs in major litigation, not looking for what was explicitly stated, but for the shape of what was being carefully avoided. What Marcus had found was not illegal. That was the first thing Ethan established, reading slowly through the financials. Vivian Hartwell was not a criminal. She was something more technically interesting than that. She was a strategist. Over the course of their 3-year relationship, the 12 investments Ethan had made at her recommendation had, in aggregate, produced a pattern. The 2 that had been structurally adjacent to entities in which Vivian held equity had generated returns that flowed through a series of holding structures that were individually unremarkable but collectively elegant, back to a Delaware LLC in which Vivian's brother held formal ownership. But Vivian held what the document described, neutrally, as operational control. She had introduced him to those investments. She had provided the due diligence documentation that was accurate but selectively framed. She had been, in essence, his financial advisor in the informal sense, while simultaneously being a silent beneficiary of the decisions he made based on her advice. The legal term for this, depending on jurisdiction and the specific structure of the advisory relationship, was somewhere between undisclosed conflict of interest and constructive fraud. The precise characterization would depend on what a forensic accountant could establish about the documented communications between them during the recommendation period. Marcus's email accompanying the document included a single sentence beyond the formal summary. "There's more here than I initially anticipated. I want to bring in a second pair of eyes from the financial forensics team. Say the word." Ethan typed back, "Say it." He closed the laptop and went to his 8 o'clock meeting, which was about a commercial lease dispute for a mid-sized retail client, and he was entirely present for it because Ethan Callaway did not allow one problem to contaminate another. What he had learned in the first years of his practice, that the attorneys who let their personal situations bleed into their professional performance were the ones who eventually had neither. He billed 4.5 hours that day. He ate lunch at his desk. He ran 6 miles after work, along a route that took him past the river, the water gray and flat in the October light. When he got home, he sat at the kitchen island with a glass of water, and he finally let himself feel the grief. It arrived quietly, the way serious things tend to arrive. Not as a crash, but as a slow pressure building behind his sternum. The accumulated weight of 3 years of a specific kind of trust that he now understood had been structured, from at least one side, with a purpose he had never been given access to. Yes, he had loved Vivian Hartwell with the particular intensity of a man who doesn't open himself easily and, when he does, commits with his entire architecture. He had told her things about himself that he had told no one else. About his father. About the years between 18 and 22, when he had nothing and built everything from a series of decisions that each felt, at the time, like they might break him. He had shown her the version of himself that existed before the suit and the firm and the courtroom posture. She had listened with what he now recognized, reading backward through the record of their relationship, as the focused attention of someone taking inventory. He sat with the grief for 40 minutes. Then he washed his face, changed into fresh clothes, and went back to his desk. Why, he spent the next 2 hours writing what he would later describe, only to himself and only in his own mind, as the structural brief. Not a legal document, a personal one. A comprehensive, organized account of every financial and emotional transaction in the 3 years he and Vivian had been together. Every investment, every conversation about money, every occasion where her professional advice had redirected a decision he would have otherwise made differently. He used the same format he used for his trial preparation. Chronological, evidence-based, no emotional editorializing. When he finished, it was past midnight. He saved the document under a file name that contained only her initials and the date. Then he closed the laptop and went to sleep, because the next 2 years were going to require him to be sharp. Tunts. And he had learned long ago that the most dangerous thing you can do in the early stages of a significant effort is to exhaust yourself before the work actually begins. The first year was architecture. Marcus Webb and the forensic accountant he brought in, a woman named Priya Chandrasekaran, who had spent a decade before private practice doing financial fraud investigation for a federal regulatory body, spent the first 3 months building what they called the map, a visual representation of every financial relationship between Ethan Callaway and the network of entities that connected, through various degrees of separation, to Vivian Hartwell. The map was not pretty. The map was, as Priya described it in her characteristically direct way during their first formal presentation, as a masterpiece of informal influence disguised as personal affection. Nothing on the map was provably criminal in the sense that would support a criminal referral. Vivian was too careful for that, or whoever had advised her was. Every individual transaction was defensible. Every recommendation she had made to Ethan could be characterized, on its own, as a good-faith business introduction between 2 educated professionals in a personal relationship. It was the pattern that told the story. The aggregate, the directionality of the money over time, the specific timing of her recommendations relative to her own equity positions, the fact that her exit, timed to the letter's delivery at the altar, had occurred precisely 6 weeks after the final tranche of returns from the most profitable of those investments had been processed. "Oh, the wedding date wasn't sentimental," Priya said, during one of their working sessions in the small conference room at Marcus's firm that they had effectively commandeered for the project. She said it without particular judgment, the way you state a finding. It was a deadline. She needed the investment cycle to complete before she left. Ethan had known this, structurally, from the Monday after the wedding. Hearing it stated plainly by someone else was a different experience. He noted the difference, filed it, and moved on. What they had, Priya and Marcus and Ethan, was not enough for litigation, not in any form that would survive discovery and withstand the counter-arguments a sharp opposing counsel would inevitably mount. Vivian was educated. She had her own attorney. And she was not going to make the kind of documented mistake that would give them clean legal leverage. What they had was enough for something else. Ethan spent the remainder of those 3 months doing 2 things in parallel. The first was a systematic restructuring of his own financial architecture. Every investment, every account, every holding, every business interest, examined, evaluated, and rebuilt. He closed 3 investment positions that Priya identified as carrying residual exposure to the network of entities adjacent to Vivian. He opened new positions in sectors that he researched independently, without introduction from anyone in the social or professional world that Vivian had occupied. What he restructured his estate planning documents with an entirely different attorney, not because there was anything wrong with the previous documents, but because the previous documents had been drafted with a different future in mind, and that future no longer existed. The second thing he did was quieter. He began, methodically and without any visible effort, to insert himself into the specific professional spaces that Vivian was building her next chapter inside. She had, in the weeks after the wedding, pivoted visibly. She had joined the advisory board of a real estate development firm called Hartwell Adjacent Ventures. The name was her family's, the venture capital behind it, partially hers. She had begun appearing at the kind of industry events where her particular combination of family money and MBA credibility opened doors that operational track record alone could not. Ethan attended some of those same spaces. Not the same events. He was careful about that. The same professional universe. The same networks, accessed through different doors. He was, by the end of the first year, on the board of 2 entities that operated in adjacent sectors to Vivian's new ventures. He had been asked to join a third, but declined because the overlap was too direct, and he was not, at this stage, ready to be visible. He ran. He slept. He worked. He did not date. He was not interested in performing recovery for an audience, and he was not interested in using another person as a prop in a story that was, at this stage, entirely internal. But the people in his life who cared about him, Daniel, his mother, 2 or 3 colleagues he genuinely respected, watched him with the careful attention of people who were not sure if what they were witnessing was healthy self-possession or the very still surface of something much darker. He couldn't tell them it was neither of those things. It was work. Preparation. The disciplined, methodical process of rebuilding something stronger than what had existed before, using the destruction itself as a material source. His mother called him on the first Sunday of every month. They talked for approximately 40 minutes each time about work and family, and the small, specific details of daily life that keep a relationship functional across distance. She never asked him directly about Vivian. She asked once, near the end of one of those calls, whether he was eating properly. "Yes," he said. "And sleeping?" "Yes." "And are you—" She paused in the way she did when she was choosing her words with care. "Are you making sure you still know who you are? Outside of all of it?" He thought about that for a moment. "I know exactly who I am," he said. "That's not the part I'm rebuilding." She was quiet for a second, and then she said, "Good," in a way that meant she believed him, which was the only response that mattered. The second year was different. The second year was when the strategic position he had built began to generate its own gravity. By the 14th month after the wedding that didn't happen, Ethan had restructured his holdings to a degree that, according to Priya's last assessment, had represented approximately a 40% improvement in both liquidity and long-term value preservation compared to his pre-wedding financial position. Part of this was the market. Part of it was the closed positions. The investments adjacent to Vivian's network that he had exited and reinvested in sectors he had researched and understood independently. Part of it was something else entirely. In his restructuring, he had, guided partly by Marcus's advice and partly by his own research into financial forensics, discovered a category of investment that he had previously overlooked because Vivian had never directed him toward it. Real estate syndications structured under specific regulatory exemptions, not the kind of real estate investment that required deep operational expertise, but the kind that required exactly what he had in abundance: the ability to read complex legal documents, understand risk structures, and move decisively when the numbers were clear. He made 3 investments in this space in the second 6 months of the first year. By the 14th month, the combined return on those 3 investments had exceeded the total loss he had absorbed from closing the positions adjacent to Vivian's network. He was, in the technical financial sense, not ahead of where he would have been if the wedding had gone as planned. He was significantly ahead of where he would have been if the wedding had gone as planned, because the woman he had planned to marry had been a cost he had not yet calculated. By the 18th month, and he was doing something that had not been part of any explicit plan, but had emerged naturally from the architecture he'd built. He was writing. Not publicly. Not yet. He had kept the habit he'd developed in the first weeks after the wedding, the structured personal brief, the organized account of financial and strategic decisions, and it had evolved over 18 months of consistent application into something more sophisticated. A detailed log of his decision-making process, the specific legal and financial structures he had used to rebuild, the mistakes he had made before the wedding, and the mechanisms he had used to correct them. Daniel, who was the only person in Ethan's life who had been told the full scope of what Marcus and Priya had found in their audit, and sat across from him at a restaurant in the first week of the 20th month and said, "You know, the way you talk about all of this, it's not like talking to someone who got left at the altar. It's like talking to someone who figured out a better route." "I did figure out a better route," Ethan said. "Doesn't it bother you? Any of it?" Ethan looked at the menu for a moment, though he already knew what he was going to order. "It bothered me," he said, "for a specific period of time. And then it became information." Daniel shook his head, but not in disagreement. More in the way of someone who genuinely admires something they don't fully understand. "And her, Vivian? You never—" "No," Ethan said. "I haven't contacted her. I don't intend to." "But the financial stuff. Marcus said there might be." "There might be," Ethan said. "Well, we're still watching it. There's no point in moving prematurely." That was the other thing the second year brought, beyond the financial rebuilding. The continued watching. Priya had maintained, at Ethan's request and on retainer, a monitoring function on the publicly available financial and corporate records connected to the network of entities adjacent to Vivian. Not surveillance in any invasive sense, purely the kind of professional tracking that any sophisticated financial investigator would consider standard practice when a potential claim remained open. What the monitoring showed, through the course of the second year, was interesting. Hartwell Adjacent Ventures was expanding. Vivian was, by all visible indicators, executing precisely the professional trajectory she had described in the letter she left at the altar. And she was becoming the version of herself she had told him she needed room to become. She was also, the monitoring showed, making decisions in the new venture that were structurally similar to the ones she had guided Ethan toward in their relationship. The advisory recommendations she was making to the venture's limited partners had the same signature as the ones she had made to him. Introduced with confidence, framed with due diligence documentation, carrying an undisclosed adjacency to her own equity positions. "She's doing it again," Priya said, during a working session in the 21st month. She said it without satisfaction, just as a factual finding. Same pattern, different subjects. Different subjects who are not in a position to have commissioned this kind of audit, Ethan said. "Not yet," Priya agreed. He sat back in his chair. "At what point does the pattern become a regulatory matter?" Priya considered this with the careful precision of someone who has spent a career in the space between financial misconduct and outright fraud. If she has a formal advisory relationship with those LPs, documented, compensated, then the undisclosed conflict of interest is a materially different legal question than it was with you, because you were a partner. Personal relationships occupy a different legal space than formal advisory engagements. And if the limited partners begin to lose money in specific ways that correlate with her equity positions, then the pattern becomes a paper trail, Priya said. And paper trails are the only kind of evidence that actually matters. Ethan nodded slowly. Keep watching, he said. I always am. The party was in March. Not a party, technically. A private industry dinner hosted by a commercial real estate consortium that Ethan had joined in the 18th month of his restructuring. 60 people in a private dining room on the 43rd floor of a building in the financial district, the city laid out below the floor-to-ceiling windows like a circuit board lit from within. The invitation had arrived 6 weeks earlier. He had looked at the guest list, a standard professional due diligence habit, and found the name he knew would eventually appear in one of these rooms. Vivian Hartwell. Listed as a representative of Hartwell Adjacent Ventures, which had recently closed a Series B raise that positioned them as a moderately significant player in the mid-market commercial real estate development space. And he confirmed his attendance the same day. He wore a dark navy suit, not charcoal, a distinction that was invisible to most people and entirely intentional. He arrived 12 minutes before the formal dinner began, which gave him time to establish himself in the room with the quiet, unhurried presence of someone who belongs in a space and knows it, before the social dynamics of the evening fully formed. He spoke to 3 people in those 12 minutes. A fund manager he had met at a conference in the previous fall, an attorney from a different firm who he had opposed in litigation 4 years earlier and with whom he had maintained the civilized professional relationship that good-faith adversaries often develop. A woman named Isadora, who was the head of acquisitions for a real estate investment trust and who had, that's in their 2 previous interactions, demonstrated the kind of direct intelligence that Ethan found genuinely interesting. He was mid-conversation with Isadora, discussing a specific regulatory change that was reshaping the acquisition landscape in commercial real estate, when he felt the temperature of the room change in the particular way it changes when someone enters who has significant social self-consciousness about their own entrance. He didn't turn immediately. He let Isadora finish her thought, which was worth finishing, and he responded to it with a follow-up question that was worth asking. And then, naturally, in the course of turning to accept a glass of water from a passing server, he let his gaze move across the room. Vivian was standing near the entrance in a gold dress, not ostentatious. She had always had the aesthetic discipline to choose things that announced without shouting. The dress was the kind of gold that reads as sophisticated, rather than decorative, the cut precise enough to communicate that whoever wore it had a body she was comfortable in, and a tailor who understood the difference between showing off and presenting. She was with 2 men from her firm. She was mid-sentence to one of them, but her eyes were doing the room survey that confident people do when they enter a professional social space, cataloging, assessing, identifying the nodes of the network that were most worth approaching. Her eyes reached Ethan and stopped. The stop lasted approximately 2 seconds. 2 seconds in which every piece of social training she had and every professional composure muscle she had built over her 34 years on Earth was in full activation, doing its job well. Almost perfectly, in fact. You would have had to be watching very closely to see it. He had been watching very closely. Her eyes moved on. She returned her full attention to the man she had been mid-sentence to, and she completed the sentence, and she smiled at something he said in response, and she was once again the composed, precise, architecturally polished version of herself that she presented to professional rooms. But he had seen the 2 seconds. He turned back to Isadora, and they continued their conversation about regulatory shifts. And then the dinner was called, and people began to find their tables. He was seated, was by the arrangement of the consortium's event coordinator at table 4. He had not requested his seating. He had not needed to. When he had joined the consortium, he had spent 18 months being genuinely useful to its work, contributing legal analysis and strategic thinking to 3 of its major working groups. And the people who arranged these dinners had, naturally and without any pressure from him, begun to seat him in the rooms where the most substantive conversations happened. Table 4 was that room tonight. He was seated between the fund manager and a developer whose recent portfolio moves had been the subject of genuine professional interest in the commercial real estate space. Vivian was at table 7. He knew this because he had looked at the seating card arrangement near the entrance when he arrived. Table 7 was visible from table 4 at a specific angle. He was not going to spend the evening looking at it, but he knew its location, the way he knew the location of opposing counsel's table in a courtroom. Not something he thought about actively, but something his spatial awareness maintained passively as a matter of professional habit. The dinner was good. The conversation at table 4 was the kind that he had worked, over 2 years, to ensure he was regularly in a room for, substantive, technically precise, conducted between people who were building things rather than performing their building of things. He ate well and listened carefully, and contributed 3 observations over the course of the evening that were each received with the quiet attention that indicates genuine relevance rather than social courtesy. Isadora, who was at a different table, but caught his eye across the room at one point, raised her glass slightly in his direction. He returned the gesture. It was during the dessert course, a pear tart that was better than it needed to be, one of those small restaurant victories that you notice and appreciate without comment, that he became aware, with the peripheral precision of someone who had trained themselves to process the edges of a room without appearing to look at them, of movement from the direction of table 7. Vivian was standing. She said something to the man beside her, brief and social, and then she began to move, not toward the exit, toward his section of the room. He did not alter his posture. He did not change the direction of his attention. Yet he continued his conversation with the developer beside him about the structural challenges of converting existing commercial square footage to mixed-use residential, which was both genuinely interesting and an excellent topic to be discussing when you need your face to be doing something specific. She reached table 4 and stopped, not beside him, but at the corner of the table, in the space between him and the fund manager. A position that was socially ambiguous, close enough to indicate intention, far enough to allow retreat. "Ethan," she said. He finished the sentence he was midway through to the developer. Then he turned. She was exactly as she always was, which was to say, very carefully exactly as she always was. The gold dress, the hair that she had always worn with a specific precision, at the expression that she had practiced since her early 20s into something that communicated warmth without vulnerability. "Vivienne," he said, "not cold, not warm, the tone you use with a former colleague at an industry event, appropriate, calibrated, giving nothing away." She had clearly prepared something. He could see the preparation in the slight forward orientation of her shoulders, the way she had tilted her chin to the angle that photographs well, the breath she had taken before she reached the table. "I didn't know you'd be here," she said. "I mean, obviously we're in overlapping spaces now. I've been hearing your name." "I've been in the space for a while," he said. The fund manager had clocked the interaction and made the smooth, socially intelligent move of turning to speak to the person on his other side. And the developer was inspecting his pear tart with the focused attention of a man who understood he had accidentally become a spectator to something private. "You look—" She stopped herself from finishing that with, "well," which would have been too easy. "You look like you've been building something." "I have," he said. It's good to see," she said. The sentence ended in a way that suggested it had intended to go somewhere else. He looked at her with the complete, quiet attention he gave to opposing parties in depositions, the kind that was not aggressive, but was entirely neutral, that gave back precisely nothing, that created in the observed party the slightly vertiginous experience of speaking into a space that did not echo. "I've been following Hartwell adjacent," he said after a moment. The Series B was well structured." Something moved in her expression. Not surprise. She had prepared for professional conversation as a possibility. Something more specific than surprise. Something closer to relief that they were in professional terrain, and something alongside that relief that was slightly harder to name. "Thank you," she said. "It came together faster than I expected." "The LP structure was interesting," he said. "The advisory relationship model you're using with the limited partners. It's an elegant approach." She looked at him for a moment that was one beat longer than comfort. "We have good advisors," she said. "I'm sure you do," he said. A pause. "I owe you," she started. "You don't," he said, not cutting, just factual. "You don't owe me an apology at an industry dinner, Vivian. No, it's not the right setting for that conversation." She absorbed this. He could see her recalibrating in real time, the careful social processor she'd always been making the adjustments. "Is there a right setting?" she asked. The question had a different quality from the professional exchange that had preceded it. More personal, more genuine, which was either real or a very sophisticated version of her familiar approach. He considered the question with what appeared, from the outside, to be a brief and thoughtful pause, but was, from the inside, an already decided response that he was simply timing appropriately. "I don't think I'm looking for that conversation," he said, "but I appreciate the impulse." Vivian Hartwell had been in professional and social rooms for her entire adult life. She knew how to receive a rejection that was also a dismissal wrapped in courtesy. She knew how to leave a table with her composure intact. She did all of those things now. She said it was good to see him. She said she hoped they'd have the chance to connect more during the evening. She moved back toward the other side of the room with the smooth, directed walk of a woman who has decided something and is executing on the decision. He watched her go for approximately 3 seconds. Then he turned back to the developer and his pear tart, and the conversation about mixed-use conversions that he had left in the middle of. Isadora, from across the room, raised her glass again. This time, he smiled. The following 3 weeks produced an interesting development. Priya called him on a Tuesday morning during a gap between meetings. Once she did not open with pleasantry, which he had always appreciated about her. "The pattern is clean enough now," she said. "We have 23 months of documented advisory interactions between Vivian Hartwell's principal company and its limited partners. In 9 of those interactions, the recommendation she made to the LP was in a direction that generated direct or indirect benefit to a separate equity position she held. In 6 of those 9 cases, the LP subsequently lost value in the recommended investment while her position appreciated." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the legal brief on his desk that he had been reading before the call, seeing it but not reading it. Documented how? "The LPs are required to file certain disclosures. Her company's advisory interactions are part of those disclosures. It's all public record, just requiring the time and expertise to assemble in a way that shows the pattern rather than the individual transactions. And the LPs themselves, are they aware of the pattern? No. That's the thing about a pattern, you need an expert to assemble. The individual transactions look like normal variants in a market environment. It's only when you lay them side by side with her personal equity positions and the timing of each recommendation that the directionality becomes visible. Ethan set down the pen he had picked up at some point during the call without noticing. Priya, in your professional assessment, does this rise to a level where a formal referral to the relevant regulatory body would be appropriate? She paused for exactly as long as a careful person pauses before answering a question that carries significant weight. In my professional assessment, she said, yes. The pattern meets the threshold for a conflict of interest referral under the applicable advisory regulations. It's not a criminal referral. It's a regulatory one. But regulatory scrutiny of this nature would require her firm to open its books in a way that the current limited partners are not aware is possible. Ethan thought about the dinner 3 weeks earlier. The gold dress. The 2 seconds. The way she had said, "I owe you," and he had told her she didn't. I want to hold on the referral, he said, but I want everything prepared. The full documented assembly, the timeline, the specific regulatory citations, everything ready to be filed at the moment I decide it should be. Understood, Priya said. How long do you want to hold? Until the timing is right, he said. She knew better than to ask what that meant. I'll have the full package to you by end of week. The end of the week brought the package, 112 pages of documented analysis, cross-referenced, properly cited, meticulously structured. He read it over a Saturday at the kitchen island with better coffee than he'd been drinking 2 years ago, and when he finished, he felt the specific, quiet feeling of a case that is ready. Not peace. He had been precise with his mother about that. Peace was not the thing he was rebuilding toward. The thing he felt was closer to the satisfaction of a problem fully understood, ours of a piece of legal work that was complete in every detail, of a position that was sound. He placed the document in the same drawer as the letter she had written him on cream-colored Florentine stationery, and then he went for his run. The second encounter happened 4 weeks after the dinner, in a context that neither of them had planned. He was at a lunch meeting with 2 partners from a real estate investment group at a restaurant in Midtown that had the specific quality of a place that takes itself seriously without the pretense of taking itself seriously. Good light, simple table arrangements, a menu written in the kind of language that described food without performing the description. He arrived before the partners, was seated at a corner table, and ordered water. The partners arrived. Thus, they were mid-conversation about a zoning issue when one of them paused, looked past Ethan's shoulder, and said, "Is that? Yes, that's Vivian Hartwell, over there with the Donnelly Group. You know her?" Ethan did not turn immediately. He let the question land and responded to it with the mild professional recognition you extend to someone in an adjacent space. "We've met," he said. "Sharp operator," the partner said, with the specific quality of professional admiration that contains within it an unexamined warning. "She's been doing interesting things with that new venture." "She has," Ethan agreed, and moved them back to the zoning conversation. He ordered the same thing he always ordered here. He participated in the lunch with the full professional attention it deserved, yet which was genuine. These were people whose work he respected and whose business was worth cultivating. He was midway through a point about a specific regulatory arbitrage opportunity in the commercial zoning space when he heard the voice. Not near him, across the restaurant, the particular pitch and cadence of it carrying in the specific way that voices carry when a room's ambient noise briefly dips. "He's been doing well," Vivian was saying, to whomever was at her table. "I ran into him at the consortium dinner last month. He looks—" A pause that lasted long enough for the room's noise to partially close over. "He's built something, clearly." One of the partners at Ethan's table had caught the tail of it. His expression carried the polite and careful blankness of someone who was not sure how much they had overheard or whether they were supposed to have heard anything. Ethan finished his point about the regulatory arbitrage opportunity. After the lunch, walking back toward the office in the March afternoon light, pale, still carrying winter at its edges despite the calendar, he thought about what she'd said, or what he had heard of it, which was not the full sentence. He was an attorney. He knew the danger of working from incomplete transcripts, but what he had heard was consistent with what he had seen at the dinner. The 2 seconds when her room survey stopped. The "I've been hearing your name," the IOU. He had been prepared for several possible responses from Vivian, when this phase of the 2 years eventually resolved itself into an encounter. He had considered, yet in the early months, the possibility of anger, hers specifically, the kind of anger that people who have done something they know was wrong sometimes direct at the person they did it to. He had considered the possibility of indifference, the professional courtesy of 2 adults who shared a past and had moved into separate futures. He had not considered the possibility that what she felt was something closer to regret. Not the performed variety, the social currency of apology, but the quieter version that does not announce itself cleanly. The version that shows up in 2-second pauses and overheard fragments in restaurant rooms. He considered whether it changed anything. By the time he reached his office building, he had his answer. Isadora Vance had a particular quality that he had noticed first at an industry conference 8 months earlier, before she appeared at the consortium dinner. She was the kind of person whose attention, when it was directed at you, was complete. Not performative, she was not listening in order to appear to be listening. She was listening because she found the specific texture of what a person was actually saying more interesting than the overlay of what they were performing. She also understood numbers the way Ethan understood legal text, not as tools, but as language. The way the structure of a financial instrument told you something about the person who designed it, the way a particular clause in a contract told you something about the attorney who drafted it and the client who insisted on it. And he called her 2 days after the restaurant lunch. "The acquisition thing you mentioned at the dinner," he said. "The mid-market opportunity in the converted commercial space. I've been thinking about it." "You've been thinking about a lot of things," she said. He was quiet for a moment, which with Isadora was a form of communication. She had the patience to let a silence develop, rather than filling it. "I have," he said. "The acquisition thing," she said. "Yes. I think there's a window in the next 6 months that doesn't exist after that. The regulatory landscape is going to shift." "I agree," he said. "I'd like to discuss it in more detail, and other things." A pause from her end, the kind that was also a form of communication. "Dinner?" she said. "Yes," he said. But they had dinner at a restaurant that neither of them had chosen specifically to be impressive, which was how they both knew it was the right place. It was a neighborhood place with good pasta and the comfortable noise of a room full of people who had come there because the food was worth coming for, not because being seen there was worth anything. They talked about the acquisition. They talked about the regulatory shift. They talked about a paper she had read and disagreed with on 3 specific grounds, and he found the 3 grounds to be well chosen. They talked about where they had each come from, not the polished career biography version, but the actual version, the specific decisions, some of which were good and some of which were bad, that had produced the current configuration. He told her at one point about the wedding, and the way you tell a significant piece of your history when the context makes it relevant rather than avoided. He told it without self-pity, and without the particular performance of having recovered from it, because he had, by this point, actually recovered from it in a way that did not require the performance. Isadora listened with her particular quality of attention. "And the financial piece," she said. "You found something there." "Yes," he said. "And you're doing something about it." "I'm doing the right thing about it," he said, "which is different from doing something about it because I'm angry." She considered this. What's the right thing? "The people she's doing it to now don't know they're being done to," he said. "I had the resources and the expertise to identify what was happening. They don't. And that changes the ethical calculation." She was quiet for a moment, turning her wine glass by the stem. "So it's not about her." "It hasn't been about her for a while," he said. She looked at him with the direct quality that he had come to understand was the one thing about her that was entirely unperformed. "Then what's it about?" He thought about this. About the 112 pages in the drawer. About the map that Priya and Marcus had spent months building. About the 2-second stop in Vivian's room survey at the consortium dinner. "Accuracy," he said finally. "Making sure the record reflects what actually happened." The spring event calendar for the Commercial Real Estate Consortium included, in the 3rd week of April, a working session that was formatted as a half-day conference for member firms and their associated advisory relationships. It was the kind of event that had a practical purpose, working through specific regulatory and deal flow questions, but also the social function of maintaining the network relationships that made the consortium's work possible. Ethan attended. He had been asked to lead a working session on the legal structures of mixed-use conversion projects, a topic on which he had, over the past year, developed what the consortium chair described as the most practically useful analysis we've had on this subject. Hartwell Adjacent Ventures was also a member firm. Vivian would be present. He prepared his working session with the standard rigor he applied to any professional presentation. Clear structure, sums, precise legal citations, practical application of each point to real scenarios that the audience would recognize. He prepared it well because it deserved to be prepared well, and because the quality of his professional output was not contingent on who was in the room. He arrived early. He set up the materials at the table where his working session would take place. He got coffee from the setup at the back of the room. Proper coffee this time, the kind served at events where the host organization understood that the quality of the refreshments communicated something about the quality of the proceedings. The room filled. He saw Vivian come in with 2 colleagues, mid-conversation, carrying herself with the specific forward momentum of someone who is navigating a professional space she has decided belongs to her. She had, he reflected, become more of what she had always been building toward. The ambition that he had once characterized to his mother as a feature had simply become larger, operating in a larger room. She found her seat at a different table for the opening plenary. He was at the front, as a session leader. Their sight lines crossed twice in the first 40 minutes, once when she looked up from whatever she was writing during a presentation, once when the room broke for coffee before the working sessions began. He was mid-conversation with the consortium chair during the coffee break when Priya called. He excused himself, stepped to the corridor outside the main room. "The regulatory body received an anonymous inquiry this morning," Priya said, "about the pattern we documented." He was very still. "That wasn't us." "No," Priya confirmed. "It wasn't. I'm at one of the limited partners. I'd guess the one with the most sophisticated financial team, based on the timing, appears to have independently identified enough of the pattern to flag it." Ethan processed this for a moment. "So the referral is happening regardless." "It appears so. The question is whether we submit our documentation as a supplementary filing, which would substantially accelerate and strengthen the inquiry, or whether we wait and see what the independent inquiry produces on its own. He looked at the wall of the corridor. A building materials spec sheet was taped there, left from some earlier event. He looked at it without reading it. "File it," he said. "Everything we have. Today." "You're sure?" "The point was never to use it as leverage," he said. "The point was to make sure the record was accurate. And if the inquiry is already happening, the most accurate version of the record needs to be part of it." "I'll file by end of business," Priya said. He ended the call. He stood in the corridor for 4 seconds, with the specific quality of stillness that he had spent 2 years developing. Not emptiness, but density. The feeling of a thing completed. Then he went back into the room, took his position at the front for his working session, and waited for the group to assemble. Vivian was at his table. Not by his design, the working sessions had been assigned by topic relevance, and the legal structure of mixed-use conversions was directly applicable to Hartwell Adjacent's portfolio. She sat across from him, 2 seats to the right. He set up his materials. He began. He was good at this. He was good. Yet he had always been good at the specific performance of precision under observation. The trial attorney's skill set, the ability to present complex information with clarity and certainty while simultaneously being aware of every face in the room. The questions the participants asked were substantive. He answered them with care. Vivian asked a question in the second half of the session. A precise question about the liability structure in conversion projects, where the original commercial tenant had a residual claim. It was a good question. He answered it completely and accurately because it deserved a complete and accurate answer. Their eyes met briefly during the answer. Just briefly. And in that brief meeting, he had the specific experience of seeing something in her expression that was neither the room survey professional nor the gold dress social compositor, something underneath those layers, something that was looking at him, at what he had become, at the working session version and the restructured portfolio version and the 2 years of quiet disciplined building version, with an expression that was too private for a professional setting and too honest to be performed. He held the look for 1 second. Then he returned his attention to the group. After the session, during the networking period before lunch, he found himself beside Isadora, who had attended a different working session and was comparing notes with an analyst from another firm. She finished her conversation and turned to him. "How was yours?" she asked. "Productive?" he said. She looked at him with her particular attention. "She was in your group?" "She was." "And?" He considered the question with the kind of honesty that he had found, over the past year, was the only version of himself that made sense around Isadora. "And she's going to have a difficult few months," he said. "The regulatory inquiry that was always coming has started arriving." Isadora didn't ask how he knew. She had come to understand, over the course of their growing familiarity, that he knew things because he had built the infrastructure to know them. "Did you?" "We filed supplementary documentation today," he said, "to make sure the record was accurate." "Not punitive," she said. Not a question. "Not punitive," he confirmed. She looked at him for a moment. You know what I find interesting about you?" "Tell me." "You built a 2-year case," she said. "Legal, financial, forensic. And you filed it today, at a conference where she's in the room. And you didn't tell her. You didn't give her the speech. You didn't make her understand what you'd done." "She'll understand it when the inquiry contacts her firm," he said. "But you won't be there for that." "No," he said. "And that doesn't bother you." He thought about the specific satisfaction of a case that is ready. The 112 pages in the drawer. The map. the 2-second stop. The letter on cream-colored stationery. "No," he said. Isadora smiled at him, the specific one that she reserved for moments when she thought he had said something worth the economy it was delivered with. The lunch was called. They went in together. Just 2 weeks after the consortium event, Marcus Webb sent a brief email with a summary of the initial regulatory response to their supplementary filing. The inquiry had been formally opened. Hartwell Adjacent Ventures had received its first notification from the regulatory body. The documentation Priya and Marcus had assembled was being reviewed. The email concluded, "Whatever happens from here is in their hands. We've done our part." Ethan read it twice, the way he always read important correspondence. Then he archived it in the same folder as the preliminary findings from 2 years earlier. He called his mother that Sunday, as he did on the first Sunday of every month. They talked for 40 minutes. About work, about family, about the small, specific details. She mentioned that she had heard, through a mutual acquaintance, was that there had been some professional difficulty for that young woman. Her mother had a delicate vocabulary for people she had decided not to name. "I know," Ethan said. A pause. "Were you involved in that?" He thought about how to answer this with precision. "I made sure the record was accurate," he said. She was quiet for a moment. "That's very much something you would do," she said finally. "Not with judgment. With the specific recognition of someone who knows the full architecture of a person and can identify where a given decision fits inside it." "It is," he agreed. "And are you—" She did the careful pause. "Are you done with it now?" He looked out the window of his apartment, a different apartment than the one with the ghost rectangles, a place he had moved to 8 months into the rebuilding. A space that was entirely his own construction, with no absent paintings on the walls. The view was of the city in the afternoon light, the buildings arranged in their permanent indifference to individual human stories, doing what they always did. "Yes," he said. "I'm done with it." He was at the airport on a Thursday morning when she called. He was at the gate for a flight to Seattle, where a commercial real estate case had entered its final pre-trial phase and required his presence, and he was reviewing notes on his laptop when his phone showed a number he had not seen in 25 months, but had not deleted. He looked at the number for the duration of one breath. Then he answered. "Vivienne," he said. A pause. The kind that tells you a person had prepared an opening and has decided in the last moment not to use it. "I assume you've heard," she said. "Yes. And I assume—" She stopped. Restarted. The documentation they received. It was comprehensive. The kind of comprehensive that requires significant resources and significant time to assemble. "It does," he said. Another pause. He heard the ambient sound of wherever she was, an interior space, the faint sound of other voices at a distance, a building rather than a street. Ethan. The way she said his name was different from the way she had said it at the consortium dinner, stripped of its professional register. Something underneath it that was the voice of a person rather than the version of a person she presented to rooms. "I'm at the airport," he said. "I have about 8 minutes before boarding. I know there's nothing I can say that—" She stopped. "I just need you to know that I understand what you did, and why." He considered this. "What do you think I did?" he said. A pause. "You protected other people from a pattern you identified, because you had the tools to identify it, and they didn't." "Yes," he said. "You didn't." She seemed to be choosing carefully. "You didn't do it to hurt me." "No," he said. "I didn't." The boarding announcement came over the terminal speakers. His row. I have to go, he said. Ethan? A beat. Are you? She seemed to stop herself from finishing the question she had started. I'm well, Vivian, he said. I'm genuinely, specifically well. Not the kind you say when someone asks. He heard her exhale, just briefly. I can hear that, she said. In everything. Your work. The way the room responds to you now. I can hear it. Good, he said, and he ended the call, placed the phone in his jacket pocket, and closed his laptop. He stood, gathered his carry-on bag, and joined the boarding line. The man ahead of him in the line was reading something on his phone, holding it with both hands. The woman behind him was talking quietly to a child who was asking a question about airplanes. The terminal had the specific quality of concentrated human momentum. All those individual trajectories briefly organized into a single line for a single purpose. Ethan Callaway handed his boarding pass to the attendant, walked down the jet bridge, found his seat, and looked out the window at the tarmac. He was flying to Seattle to win a case. He took his laptop out and opened it,